Oh, thank you for that reminder. Recording now. Awesome. Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining tonight, and welcome to Climate Convo's fifth and final workshop of our series. If this is your guys' first time attending a meeting and you don't know me yet, my name is Danica. I use she, her pronouns, and I started this club this quarter as a space for UCSB's environmentalists to come together to share and cope with any emotions that arise when coming to awareness of the state of the world today. Our meetings are a safe space to express concerns and questions that may feel difficult or uncomfortable to discuss in everyday life. Thank you to all of you for showing up and for being brave tonight. I'm incredibly excited to introduce our panelists for the evening, Sarah Jaquette Ray and LaUra Schmidt. LaUra is the founder of the Good Grief Network and the brain behind the 10 Steps to Resilience and Empowerment in a Chaotic Climate program and the Flow Facilitation Training. She is a truth seeker, community builder, cultural critic, trainer, program designer, and facilitator. LaUra is a lifelong student, curator, and practitioner of personal and collective resilience strategies. She is from Michigan and graduated with a BS in Environmental Studies, Biology, and Religious Studies. Her MS is in Environmental Humanities. LaUra earned certificates in Integrative Somatic Trauma Therapy and Climate Psychology. Thank you for being here, LaUra. And our second panelist is Dr. Sarah Jaquette Ray, who works at the intersection of social justice and climate emotions, an environmental humanist with a BA in Religious Studies, an MA in American Studies, and a PhD in Environmental Sciences, Studies, and Policy. Dr. Ray draws on an eclectic range of disciplines and epistemologies in service of climate justice. She is the author of 2 books, The Ecological Other, Environmental Exclusion in American Culture, on the logic and effects of social control and environmental thought, and A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, How to Keep Your Cool on a Warming Planet, which is an existential toolkit for the climate generation. Dr. Ray is co-hosting a free conference, which you are all welcome to attend, virtually happening on April 27th and 28th, on the topic of environment justice and the politics of emotion at UC Riverside. She co-leads an international network working to develop an existential toolkit for climate justice educators, which has a website of open access teaching resources on how to bring emotions into climate education, and co-edited a book by the same name, which will be coming out next year. Ray offers a professional development workshop to help center emotions in climate work called the Climate Wisdom Lab, and is a certified mindfulness teacher through the UCLA Mindfulness Awareness Research Center. Her next mindfulness course, Cultivating the Climate Mind, will be available as a virtual offering every Tuesday evening in May if you're interested in joining. Dr. Ray consults extensively on emotions and climate justice activism and has published on this topic in popular venues such as the LA Times, Scientific American, the Cairo Review of Global Affairs, EdgeFX, KCET, One Earth Sangha, and Zocalo Public Square. A huge thank you to the both of you for taking the time and energy to be here tonight. Members, you are all welcome to submit any questions you may have throughout the discussion into the chat, which I will read. And our first question of the night is, what is your personal preferred practice that helps you with emotional self-regulation?
You want me to go first, Sarah?
Yeah, Danica, do you want to set us up who you want us to speak first so LaUra and I can bounce off each other? How do you want us to take the order of question? Do you want us to both answer it or?
Whoever feels, how about Sarah, you answer first and then LaUra, if you don't mind responding.
She got me. Okay. First of all, thank you so much for all of you for coming. It's fun. I'm seeing all these names and thinking, it'd be so fun to see your faces, but no problem. I mean, I fully understand it's late and nobody wants to get on their face at Zoom at this time. So it's nice to see your names. And it's really great to share this space with LaUra, whose work I follow and collaborate with occasionally, and just love that we're getting to be in this together. We don't do this very often. So thanks, Danica, for bringing us together. And the question was personal practice. This is a really difficult question. All your questions are powerful, and I don't really have a great answer for this because it depends on the day and depends on what's causing my despair in that particular moment, you know. But I think that the one that brings me out of the darkest time is it, and then from there I can kind of claw my way into other practices that might be also really supportive. But that the one that is really a reframe or a mental shift. It might be kind of a CBT method, kind of behavioral therapy method, where when I'm feeling things are very, very awful and I can't figure out how to move forward, I just ask myself this question that one of my Buddhism teachers has offered, which is, what else is true? And this question helps me think about all the other reality that is wonderful and positive, and where the stuff I love is all, and the stuff, all the hard work of other people and how they're all showing up despite all the bad news too. And then I it just shifts my energy, and it shifts my willingness to engage in the day. And it's not really I don't know, it's a mental practice, sure, but it's not like a particular meditation or some kind of power smoothie or something. It's just a question that I reach to like a lifeline when I'm really in the low. And then the reminder that there's all this good stuff, and I love a lot of stuff, and there's beauty and great people, helps me start to get out of the hole. And then I start these feedback loops of other positive things to keep going. So it has to do with my negativity bias of my brain getting really, really down a rabbit hole of bad things. And I fail to notice myself even do it. I'm just in it. And I think this is reality. And it just takes that little bit of effort to say, oh, what else is true? There's so much else that's true. I don't know if that makes sense, but I'm going to stop there and see if LaUra, I want to learn what LaUra's practice is. Oh.
Thanks, Sarah. And thanks for having me, Danica. I love what else is true. That's a great practice. I slow down. I try to go as slow as possible. I speak fast, I think fast, I do fast. And so my main practice is trying to intentionally create pauses and slow down. And in slowing down, I really try to notice the everyday beauty that's around me. I try to notice the seasonality changes. I try to notice when there's new growth on a plant, either in my house or outside. I practice gritty gratitude. I think gratitude gets kind of a bad rap as being commercialized, but I think it's a really gritty practice in nature. And it does the same thing, Sarah, you were talking about sort of flipping the script. It has us noticing what's still there. It has us feeling fulfilled instead of lack. And I feel a lot of gratitude for beauty as well. And then I struggle with a regular meditation practice. And so I kind of made up my own, and I call it letting my feelings catch up with me, because I'm really good at compartmentalizing and getting a bunch of work done throughout my day. And then at the end of the day, I have to kind of sit still and think, what have I not touched today? What is in my body that is really begging for my attention? And usually it's a lot of grief. So I just try to sit with some grief and let a little bit in at a time and process it. So those are just some of my practices that I try to do to regulate and keep me here and present.
Thank you both for those answers. Our second question is, do you have a healing or useful response to the question, what's going to happen and how much time do we have left?
All right, we're going this way. Okay. All right. LaUra. All right. This is I don't know about you, LaUra, but when I read Danica's questions, I actually felt my my heart rate increase. And so Danica offered us her questions in advance for all of you who are here, and there's like 20 of them, something. I don't know how many there are, but as I read through them, I kept thinking, that's a big one. That's a meaty one. I'm gonna have to chew on that for a while. I don't have a good answer for that one. Oh gosh, that's my question too. Or this is the stuff, this is really it, you know, and I really found myself feeling tight. I even feel myself tight now, going, oh God, I don't have answers. This is the most important stuff. So just a pause between the questions was helpful for me. And this is a big one. So can you say it again, Danica? So just so I can really feel like the pith of it.
Yes, absolutely. Do you have a healing or useful response to the question, what's going to happen and how much time do we have left?
Yeah. I don't have an answer to the question, what's going to happen? I think that there's a potential for a lot of really great things and a lot of bad things. And there's also the refocus of the attention to that's always been the way it is, and that's also happening now. So there's a lot of anticipatory anxiety about what's going to happen around the corner. I think that's really the essence of climate anxiety. Really has to do with this futurity of the possibilities of uncertainty. And I think learning to figure out, for those of us who have not experienced a lot of uncertainty in our lives, and that's a very small percentage of the human population on the planet, right? Most people have experienced a lot of uncertainty. And so this is not a new quality of thinking about the future. So there's a lot to learn from a lot of the other people who have wisdom around this. They've been living with uncertainty in lots of spaces and times. So I think that's one healing practice, is to look to the people who've been doing this. And learning how to, the practices that, for me, who I've been so privileged to have so much stability in my 46 years of my life, that the practice is getting comfortable with that uncertainty, because the uncertainty can engender this anxiety that can lead to amygdala hijack, my nervous system blowing out, burnout, all kinds of things. And frankly, that's not the reparation that the planet and other communities need from me. I think a lot of people delude themselves into thinking that things are so bad and I'm so complicit. And so the right solution is sort of like this punishment, something, right? Like I should suffer, you know, I need to manufacture my own suffering, so at least I'm on par with all the suffering else in the world or something. And that's unconscious. I see it in my students all the time, as unconscious, like guilt turning into self-flagellation or something. And I don't think that's useful at all. And the learning to live with uncertainty practice, healing practice, learning from other people who've had uncertainty or who are living in uncertainty, doing that together is the practice I would put on the table as my clearest answer at this point.
I love Sarah's answer of reaching out to people who have weathered a lot of uncertainty. In my preparation for tonight, I collected a bunch of quotes, because if I don't have the answers, somebody has the answers somewhere. You know, you just got to find the quote from the wise person who said it. And for this one, I have James Baldwin, who said, "No one can possibly know what is about to happen. It's happening each time for the first time, for the only time." And so I come back time and time again to the idea that the future isn't set. And though things can look really bleak, we don't know the outcome. We only have this present moment. And so instead of focusing on these fears and you know, projections of what might come about, I think it's more helpful to focus on actions that generate connection, healing, and service to the larger world, to our communities, to the more than human world. And I think if we start setting the conditions for the co-creation of life-sustaining pathways forward and let go of outcome, that's what we're being asked to do in this time. And so the question of like, how much time do we have left, it's not a helpful question. You know, it's kind of putting our projections into the future instead of keeping our agency in the present moment. And I think a lot about the fact that I could fall ill, I could die tomorrow in an accident. And so again, it's not helpful to think about how much time I have left, because no one knows that. That's the great mystery of being in this human condition and living this life is perhaps we only have until tomorrow. And so what are we doing today?
Thank you both. The next question is, what do you think is humanity's responsibility in fixing the environmental damage we have caused?
This is another complicated one, because I immediately want to go to my academic critique, like, oh, the premise of the question is flawed or whatever, and on the one hand, on the other, I will offer that, but I also think that's the way many people feel, right? The part of the there's some interesting research that's just come out, and I'll try to drop it in the chat after I speak for a second, but humanity, only a small percentage of humanity has caused this problem. In general, humanity for a long time has not caused this problem. So this notion that humanity has caused the problem is a very modern, very new concept. And I think that the challenge there becomes to think about the very specific ways of thinking by a very small fraction of humanity who happen to have a lot of power. That is manageable. Trying to fix all of humanity to do the right thing feels impossible. And I think the error in saying humanity is not just that it's inaccurate, but it tricks us into thinking that the task of changing the course of what's happening is impossible. And if we think of it as, oh no, it's just a small fraction of humanity, it feels more manageable to me, right? So I think there's a couple of things there. And also when we see all the, sort of in that, classic Mr. Rogers story about seeing all the helpers, if we think of, let's say, just to pull a number out, 90% of humanity as sort of trying to help, or if not, mostly are suffering from the consequences of that other 10% and don't have much agency to change that, then there's a lot more opportunity for compassion and all kinds of other positive emotions that can be generative of the work, rather than what I find in a lot of my students is that they don't have that kind of more nuanced idea of what humanity is. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it inherently selfish? Is it,
Hello?
Oh, is there a phone call? Sorry. Sorry, somebody's not on mute. Sorry. I'm going to answer the phone too. But it has us feeling actually more hostile towards each other than we should. And so I worry about the clustering of humanity in one group and how that makes people hate humanity, right? Becomes this, what Karen Lifton calls the misanthropic temptation. And the misanthropic temptation, the anti-human temptation, is not good for other humans, much less the planet. So there's that. And how to fix that is, I'm personally, the reason why you started this group is you had some instinct in you that we had the technology, we have the economics, we know all the leverage points in the system. And what we need is a change of hearts and minds, values, what Donella Meadows calls the most fundamental, top number one, most impactful leverage point in the system, to actually put all those things into play. So to me, it's not just about the slow process of changing hearts from the ground up and the grassroots. I actually agree with Donella Meadows that the number one, the biggest leverage point is hearts and minds. So that's my long answer to that.
And my answer is similar. But I'll just word it just a little differently in that we're in a crisis of deep disconnection, predominantly in the dominant culture. And so if we are to move towards solution making, the solutions have to happen in a way that reconnects us with ourselves. We're very disconnected from ourselves. We need to connect with our communities and the people around us, the whole global human community and the more than human world. which also means that for those of us that have grown up in and learned from the dominant culture, that we probably carry around a lot of supremacies within us. And so a lot of the fixing is also a lot of the undoing work, and a lot of the leaving behind the values, the ideas, the norms that don't actually serve us. So radical reconnection and a lot of undoing work, and learning how to be in right relationship with the planet and our fellow kin. I think that would move us in a pretty important direction towards healing and recovery.
Thank you so much. Our next question is, how should ES majors think of hope?
And I think it'd be fun to switch it up and start with
No, it's great. I was thinking about how powerful it is to have us three talking, because Danica's a current environmental studies student. I was a former environmental studies student, and Sarah teaches environmental studies students. And so we have a powerful array of voices and heart gathered here. And I really like to talk about hope, and I don't know that there's enough time to get into my philosophy of hope. And so I'll use Joanna Macy's philosophy of hope here. And that's that Joanna Macy teaches that we can feel hopeful or hopeless depending on what we ate for breakfast, or if we've had a recent fight with someone that we love, and that our hope is really determined by our emotional reactivity. And so I think that it's harmful if we base all of our actions on hope. Joanna says, when you're in the middle of a big adventure, you don't have time to decide whether you're hopeful or hopeless. All of your energy should be right here in the present moment. I also have learned a lot from the Strozzi Institute in their work in somatics, and they teach that we can be present, open, and connected in each moment. And we can look for ways to increase connection, meaning, and joy. And I think that work and that invitation is much more useful than whether or not we have hope.
All right. I love that you said that we have this trio of environmental studies people and all these different, yeah, these are my people. And the UCSB environmental studies community I'm pretty familiar with, because I'm colleagues with John Foran and David Pello and Ken Hiltner, and there's a bunch of Santa Barbara faculty who I really admire and appreciate. So I'm sure you're all taking classes with those folks and loving it. But this hope question, I just came across, I'm thinking that LaUra, you probably are also following this too, but the last interview with Mike Davis. If you're not familiar with who Mike Davis is, he's the author of a lot of really great critical cultural theory, like The City of Quartz, which is about LA, and all kinds of stuff about the kind of environmental and social justice dimensions of a lot of California stuff, which is really cool. But anyway, this last interview, he died recently, and his last interview, he said something like, I don't think hope is what we're trying to hold on to. He said something to the effect of, it's not the thing that motivates long-term engagement, which is what we think, oh, we need hope because that's the thing that's going to make people engage for their long term, because without hope, then you give up. So it's not that hope is the point. Hope is the means to this other end that is about getting people to engage long term. So if we're focusing on getting people to engage long term, then we have a different set of questions to ask. What makes people engage long term? And it turns out hope isn't actually the answer to that. So it might be nice to feel hopeful, but that's not a prerequisite for what I think people are looking at when they're talking about, let's find hope, or put hope in our syllabus or whatever. And actually what Mike Davis said is that anger and love are emotions that drive long-term engagement far more. And I'm sure you could do a qualitative or even a scientific study of this. I haven't got that research on my fingertips, but it'd be an interesting study. How much does anger and love motivate long-term engagement more than hope? I mean, I find this kind of sort of different emotions locking in different types of behaviors with different people differently in different times of their lives and whatever. So interesting. And so, yeah, I like hope. It's fine. I fully agree with Laura's definition and Joanna Macy's definition. But I also wanted to add this other thing, you know, is it hope we're really going for? Is that kind of a red herring? I don't know. What can we do with anger and love that might be even more effective? I don't know. I mean, I don't have the answers, but just exploring all the roles of these different emotions in our lives is fascinating.
Thank you. Our next question is, our generation worries about bringing kids into this world. What do you think about this?
I tried to think about an answer for this because it's so complicated, and the only thing I came up with is it's a deeply personal choice, and I don't have kids, and so I don't know that I have anything really important or of substance to share, and so I'll pass it over to both of you, and perhaps you can deepen this part of the conversation.
Danica, you want to go?
I guess this question came from a very young age. I knew that I didn't want kids. And that's like, I guess recently I've realized that like it kind of sucks that I never got to even want that from a young age, because I grew up learning about climate change. And I'm still kind of like trying to wrap my head around ideas of life that I think are like the good life or what I should want, that also aligns with what I think is right and should be happening at this time. I don't know. My ideas are kind of all over the place.
That didn't seem all over the place to me. That was beautiful and very concise. It would be awesome. You know, that's a question that I bet there's a lot of really great thoughts in the audience here too. If it's okay, Danica, to invite this to come out in the chat, your audience's response to this question.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone who wants to unmute at this time, or if you don't feel comfortable, you can also type in the chat as well.
Yeah. So the question is, what would you say to people who are thinking about this question? And you know, I think it's interesting because this particular question seems to be coming up more and more and more and more intensely than it ever. I mean, I've been now teaching environmental studies for a long time, and it's only in the last couple of years, even less than a year maybe, that it's become kind of a fever pitch of interest in this question. And I would also, I haven't seen, and so I can't vouch for it, but there's a Canadian public broadcast film that has recently come out in Canada and will be available, I believe, this month or next month in America, called The Climate Baby Dilemma. Have you heard of that, LaUra? Maybe? I don't know. Britt Ray's kind of into that thing. So, and Britt Ray, her newsletter has quite a bit of really great stuff in a very recent piece on how young people like Danica, you're describing, are growing up the climate generation, thinking about kinship and relationship and mutual aid, and how do we support each other that's not just participating in these very heteronormative nuclear family structures that have been really not very good for people who identify as male, female, much less the environment, actually. So there's a lot of really cool research and sort of experimentation happening around different types of community building and community creation, that I think is really generative and regenerative, and at a pretty exciting time where a lot of people are feeling this way. And the more they talk to each other about the way they feel, the more creativity around that is coming up. Like, how can we come up with an alternative arrangement of care? You know, and to even think of caregiving as a value is radical and new. So I think the fact that this conversation has gone as far as it's gone is pretty exciting. It's bringing up a lot of really important questions around equality, division of labor, gender expectations, whether the state subsidizes certain types of relationships and whether that's good or not, whether the state ought to have more of a role in supporting community in other ways, how people are making community because the state doesn't. You know, there's all kinds of really cool questions around social reproduction that are happening beyond just a nuclear family that I think is really great, including the more than human world, So kinship around the more than human world, which is often being explained to me by Indigenous scholars and thinkers who are saying, hey, we've been thinking about this stuff for a long time, Sarah, So there's a lot of models and a lot of, the heteronuclear family nuclear model is the one that everyone thinks is the dominant one, but there's so much creativity happening. And I think it's a really great time for that. So I'm optimistic about that, but I also hear the heartbreak in a lot of that, a lot of what you just said, Danica, and in a lot of young people saying, I always thought I was going to be a parent. And what does this mean for me? And this is like an identity crisis, So there's a real existential conversation to be had around this, and grief to go to what LaUra's an expert in. I think there's a lot of grief there too, a lot of emotions. And I don't have advice. I'm going to stick with LaUra's advice, which is it's very personal. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being open to discussing your ideas on that. I'll move on to the next question, which is, I feel that any change I could make is insignificant. How do I find meaning and motivation in environmental work?
That's a good question. It's like Sarah said, that you sent us these questions ahead of time and you're like, whew, that's a big one. I think that part of the insignificance that we feel is because somehow we inherit a story, whether we tell ourselves or people tell us the story, the culture tells us the story, that we somehow have to be the ones to fix this as individuals. And that's a lot of pressure, especially when the system seems so big and immovable. And what I've found for myself is what helps me is doing my work with courage and with heart, and that will always be enough. That is never insignificant work. It's actually really hard work to stay open to courage and to keep your heart open, particularly in really disheartening times. And so, yeah, I think it might always feel like the job isn't done, and it's because it won't be. And I think that instead of focusing on the outcomes, we focus on the process, we focus on our values, we root in the things that really matter, which are connection and joy and meaning, and reducing harm. And as long as we use that as our guiding path, then I think it reduces the question of whether or not what we're doing is insignificant or not enough or insufficient. Instead, it says, I'm showing up and I'm doing it with an open heart and I'm doing it with openness. So I think that's how I would answer that one.
I love that, the centrality of courage in that answer, because I think it's so, I don't know, that's not, I don't want to say cool, but it feels like part of the affective performance of climate folk is this kind of, cynicism and despair. Like, aren't you paying attention to the news? If you're not angry or upset or totally undone, you're not paying attention to how bad things are. And I'm completely empathetic to that, because I spend about half my time in that mode. So, I get it. But that's really, that can really burn you out, and that can really make you not see what else is true, to go back to the original thing. And we are biologically human beings driven by, some people call the brain a pleasure-seeking machine, right? So there's this kind of basic need for something positive in our lives to keep us going. And the news about the climate is like a stick beating us, right? And what's the carrot? What are we drawn to? What do we desire? What do we want out of this? And I think we don't focus enough on those questions, and think that if we're okay, and if we're in a place of pleasure, rooting in pleasure, as LaUra said, that somehow we're not engaged enough or being good enough or doing enough. And I think the younger generations like Gen Z, college students, are figuring that out in a way that older generations still haven't really figured out. That I really appreciate the fact that you've got to dance and you've got to be singing. You have to find the joy in your life to do this. So the question is, how do you keep doing it? There's every single day goes by. Every single day I say, I'm inadequate, not good enough, need to do more. If I really cared, I'd do this. If I was really good, I would do this. If I was whatever, I have millions of places that I think I need to do better. And I'm just guessing, LaUra and Danica, you probably feel the same. Maybe other people in this group feel the same constant sense of inadequacy. And it is actually, I'm coming to learn by reading folks like Tricia Hersey's book, that Rest is Resistance, that sense of inadequacy is actually a way that productivist, capitalist, extractive mentality is working through me. And that a form of resistance to that is to not think that way. And then it goes to kind of this Adrienne Marie Brown-esque kind of abundance, a sense of abundance and enoughness is a radical act against capitalism. And Reverend Walt Kimmerer talks about that. And a lot of really beautiful thinkers out there are really pushing forward this idea. And so I try, like I said, I get there one day a week, maybe, to think that I'm enough and that I can find pleasure and that it's okay, and do as LaUra said, use these kind of compasses, am I doing harm today? Kind of go to bed every night and think, what harm did I do today? How can I own that? Or can I even repair it tomorrow? But at some point we have to accept that what we've got is enough and embrace it, because the alternative actually fuels capitalism more. The attitude of inadequacy is what commercials and media and corporations need us to constantly be in a state of, so that we keep buying shit, and so it's a resistance to not feel inadequate. And I don't know how to do that, but if you can do that one day a week, it's a start.
Thank you for that response. And it actually prompts another question that I had, which is, I've realized we live within the problem. US culture seeps into our values and most basic ideas about what life should look like. How can I begin to recognize and unlearn aspects of my lifestyle that perpetuate an exploitative system that does not align with my values?
Sarah, I think it's time to flip it again. I think it's time for you to go first.
I love this question. By the time I got to this question, I was just like, oh gosh, we're gonna be sweating by the time we get here. I love this question. I would love to hear, I'd love anybody who's thought through this question in the chat. I'd love to see what people are saying. I honestly didn't even, I spent so much of my career in a constant state of saying, I'm not the problem. Corporations, systems, structures are the problem. So it's only in recent years that I've thought any differently about that. And it's not that that's not true. Those things are in fact true. But it has been not a depressing, self-flagellating, self-hating experience, but rather an empowering experience to come to terms with, maybe I actually do have some control over the situation. Maybe I do have some agency in reducing the harms that I see all these other people doing, these awful, evil people. And so that was where I first turned a corner on that. Maybe, even if it's small, I simply can't constantly point my finger at other people if I haven't looked at myself and done that myself. And then I heard something, Thich Nhat Hanh said this, the Vietnamese monk said something like, something really, at the time I thought was so cliche, but it's really sunk in over the years, that you can't ask for peace in the world unless you can find peace in yourself. And that was, you can substitute peace for anything, right? You can't ask for no harm and justice in the world if you're in fact letting those systems of harm work through you, do their work through you. Tricia Hersey calls it donating your body. You're donating your body to these destructive systems. So I realized how much I was swimming in this water, right? You start to, through mindfulness, I started a mindfulness practice. I started diving into mindfulness and starting slowly to realize what's the nature of the water I've been swimming in and how those systems use me for their ends and how I then become a front line for resistance against those things. And then I realized how much work I have to do. It is huge, huge. And so then you have a life plan, there's no lack of purpose there. And it's actually very empowering, right? I don't have to wait around for some, as Rebecca Solnit says, some magical politician to come and fix everything. It's all the work is right here. So that's a mindfulness practice is my really simple answer to that question. But reading these books, these people like Tricia Hersey, Adrienne Brown, they have helped me so much. All the reading, honestly, all these other thinkers helping me see, oh God, that's not a good way of thinking. My latest book I'm obsessed with is Vanessa Machado de Oliveira, who's Vanessa Andreotti, also her work in hospicing modernity. I highly recommend this book, or anything on Gesturing Towards a Decolonial Futures collective website. I'll throw those things in the chat when I'm done, but reading that book blew my mind. All of a sudden there's more mirrors holding up about the work I can do, So yeah, there's so much for us to do, and that's empowering. It's liberating all of our energy, to reduce harm. So yeah, LaUra.
Yes, Sarah, 100%, right on board with you. Definitely highly recommend Hospicing Modernity. It's nice because she's a really fierce writer, and through a lot of what she's saying, she's like, you might not want to hear this. You might not be ready to hear this. You might not want to read this. And so she's like challenging us and acknowledging that literally you're going to be changed by the time you get to the end of the book. It's a really powerful invitation. And I have a similar quote. I think it's from Alice Walker as to the Thich Nhat Hanh quote, but it's something like, if you want to stop the terrorism in the world, you have to stop the terrorism in your own heart. And it's the idea that what's happening in the external world is really happening to us first in our internal world. And it's happening a lot through our programming and our conditioning and what we're taught through our cultural norms and how we're taught to relate to each other, including the more than human world. And when I reflected on this question, my first answers were read and listen and learn from people who are not like me, who are not living my same experience, because wisdom comes in all different types and forms. And, read from people from different countries, different cultures, learn from people who have different perspectives, different values. Like, how do people see the world differently than what you see the world as? And then start questioning your norms, start questioning why you do certain things. Bayo Akamalafe often says that we have to question our questions. And I think it's really hard. It's a self-reflexive practice, because you have to be aware that you have assumptions before you can question your assumptions. So there's like multi-layer of like unraveling that you have to do to understand why you act the way you do and why we act collectively the ways that we do. And I am a big advocate for learning how to be uncomfortable, not unsafe. We don't want to be unsafe. We don't want to we don't want to like topple over an edge, but we do want to go to the edge so we can see the horizons in a different way and start taking on new perspectives. And so our best learning or unlearning happens when we're not comfortable. And so my suggestion about a place to start is make yourself a little bit uncomfortable. And if somebody says something that makes you uncomfortable, sit with it for a minute, see where they're coming from.
Thank you so much, both of you. And kind of a question within the same vein, but the same systems that exploit the earth also call on us to deplete ourselves. What is your relationship to that system? Do you feel yourself participating in it, and when? And how do you move through and or around those systems? I can also send it in the chat. I know it's
Yeah,
kind of
I love that question. I'm going to really try to keep mine short because I said a little bit about that already, but one of the activities, and Laura's familiar with this, that I love to explore this is the Joanna Macy work that reconnects the milling, and when I do the milling exercise as a participant or as a facilitator, the milling, you can check it out online. It's this activity that helps you feel through your body how it is that the speed of your life causes you to harm other people, and or at the very minimum not regard them. And you can think of the more than human world in that category too. You can think of your own family, all of these, not to mention your own self. There's a famous experiment called the Good Samaritan experiment that showed how the more time scarce that we perceive ourselves to be, the more our ethics go out the window. There's some famous quote that comes with that. But the punchline to that is the many, many, many ways that I could answer that question. But the one that I feel like is the big aha that I've been having of late has to do with how my perception of being time scarce causes me to walk through the world in ways that are harmful that I don't even notice. And that perception is really a perception. It's not reality. And it's up to me to live to create a different reality. And so I'll leave it at that because that kind of probably sets LaUra up for something about going slow. I don't know. I like it though. I'm waiting. It's a great question.
I am going to talk about going slow. You're right. I'm really busy. I busy myself a lot. I go really fast. I already said that. And one time I did a rites of passage event where I fasted for 3 days in the wilderness and was by myself. And I realized how much time there is in a day. And like in my normal life, I don't take any time to slow down. And I get to the end of my evening and I'm like, I didn't have time to do this or this or this or this. And I think it goes back to what Sarah's saying is, where am I placing my attention? Where am I putting my priorities? And so I suppose what I'm trying to point to is, for a short time, I lived outside of the system. I lived outside of my business as usual of productivity at all expenses, and actually realized that days are really long when they're not surrounded by food or emails or reading or, all the things that we busy ourselves with. And I think this question is really important because the same systems that exploit Earth and ask us to deplete ourselves are the same systems that also have us othering our siblings and our kin. And so it's like a multifaceted problem that can be made a little bit more simplistic by realizing that the magnitude of everything we're facing is actually deeply interrelated and deeply linked. And so if we start pulling out some of these threads of disconnection and start actually focusing more on how to reconnect, a lot of these problems will start to resolve themselves, or at least will be put on a path of resolution and of healing. And so, yeah, I'll acknowledge that I'm a little bit stuck in the system, I run a nonprofit. You have to do the nonprofit grind to stay afloat. And oftentimes you spend more time trying to keep the nonprofit afloat than doing the work that you wanted to do to begin with. And so it's like a constant balance of being stuck within the system of business as usual and trying to thwart it, trying to move around it, and trying to remember that there's actually plenty of time in the day to do lots of different things. But where am I placing my attention and my energy?
I just want to add something to that because you just made me think of something, LaUra. The connection you made between the systems that deplete us and the natural world being the reason why we then therefore do harm to our kin, or I don't know exactly how you phrase it, but that's the punchline of the milling too, right? That's exactly the insight. And what I find so interesting there is that a lot of my students, environmental studies students, will come to environmental questions from the opposite direction. They'll say things like, we can't even have social relations unless we have a planet, which the implicit argument there, and I'm empathetic for that passion and that sense of, we have to choose what the order of priorities here is, but it assumes that the solution to the planetary problems can bypass the social problems, that somehow the social problems are secondary to the climate problems. And what you're suggesting radically, and I fully agree, is that we can't solve the climate problem unless we do this relationship solving problem. And that's an insight that I think it takes a lot of environmental studies students a long time to get there, because many students come to environmental studies sort of because they don't like thinking about the messiness of human life. Not all. A lot of them want to do it, environmental work to address social justice problems. But in my major, that's the minority that come in the door. They come out thinking that way. But you know, I think it's a real seduction to think that somehow we can put the social stuff aside and worry about the climate stuff first. So thank you so much, LaUra, for pointing that out, that's not viable. That's not how it's going to go.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and I'll confess that I did come into my environmental program with that kind of thinking. You know, I actually, my wife, who's the co-founder of Good Grief Network, Amy, she was a social justice activist, and we used to have little tiffs of like, what's more important? Where do you start? What do you do? And eventually we just came to the conclusion, it's the same thing. It's deeply rooted in disconnection, and it's deeply rooted in supremacy. And so like this tug of war, this sort of feud that my wife and I had for so many years, we were like, oh, okay, actually they're both legitimate and we need to face them both.
I love that. That's so classic, isn't it?
Yeah.
Thank you both for those answers. I'll finish us off with one more question for the night. And it's going to be, I'm scared I will spend a lifetime trying to make a difference and there will still be unimaginable suffering. How should I think about suffering and my role in alleviating it?
You're leaving us with the lightest question of the night.
Well, I mean, I think LaUra and I are in agreement on this one, that there's just no way. I mean, everything that LaUra said about not attaching to outcomes. Adrienne Marie Brown has this beautiful, if you can find her piece from the Yes Magazine pleasure issue, the pleasure edition or whatever, where she edited the whole issue. One of the principles she says there is that you have to ride this line between attachment and detachment. And I love that line because that's sort of got a Buddhist flavor to it. And LaUra, your point about not attaching to outcomes is very unlike capitalist thinking, right? Capitalist thinking needs deliverables, outcomes, evidence-based X, Y, and Z, you know, and what we're suggesting here is that that's not how it's going to go. We're kind of pulling a page from Vanessa Andreotti's work that the solutions to these capitalism problems are not going to be based in the same thinking that capitalism's, you know, it's kind of an Einstein kind of a thought, you know, like we can't come up with the solutions out of the same system. And yeah, there's not going to be an outcomes that we can rest assured in thinking. Now, I love the work of Olufemi Taiwo's book, Reconsidering Reparations. At the the last like third of the book is all about climate justice, but at the very end, like the last few pages, he proposes what he calls, and he's not the first person to do this, but he really articulates it in a beautiful way, what he calls the ancestor principle. And Greta Thunberg calls it cathedral thinking. There's other ways of thinking about it, 7 generations in indigenous thought, this notion that only in a worldview where I am the individual at the center of my universe, only from that worldview does what you're describing become a source of agony. If we see ourselves in this much bigger temporal frame, this ancestor perspective, then what we complete or don't complete in our lifetime is enough. It's great. You know, we're just taking the torch from one generation and doing what we can in our time and passing it on to the next. And that's also temporally and geographically widespread. It's not just, you know, ancestor principle. So once you start thinking, again, for me, it required unlearning, to use LaUra's word, unlearning the ways that I had been produced by this colonial capitalist mentality start to see the harms that that's causing, and slowly unravel some of them and relearn different ways and try on different ways. And I think the spirit of your question, you know, it really hurts only when we think of ourselves as alone and only having a role in our lifetime. But that kind of blows the mind, right? For me, you know, but it's liberating, not fear making, that I am powerless. I'm much less of a force than I think I am, right? It's really a humbling activity for those of us attached to modernity's conceits. So yeah, great.
Yeah, I'm really moved by this question and trying to pick up the threads that Sarah has started weaving for us. And I think that we've not mentioned enough about grief and the power that can come from what happens when we let that pain in and we let that suffering in. You know, like we try so hard to fight it off or deny it or run from it or stuff it. You know, there's a lot of mechanisms that many of us use to not be with the pain of the world. And I think sometimes we cause more suffering within ourselves and within our communities just by trying to run away from the tremendous amount of pain that's waiting for us. And so all of our role should be to befriend it, you know, to invite it over for tea and see what it has to teach us, and then carry it on its way or tell it it can't stay. Francis Weller talks a lot about the maturity that comes if we're willing to touch our grief and to be in it. And there's a lot of theorists who talk about how the dominant culture lacks elders. And I think it's because we have this aversion to pain and we have this aversion to discomfort. And so we don't actually embark on the grieving process and we don't let it transform us and see what wisdom it has to give us. And so much of this connection that we've been talking about this whole time, so much of these sort of new paradigms that we're trying to create are on the other side of being willing to feel that pain and that grief and just be with suffering instead of just trying to keep it at an arm's length. And so, you know, we need to cry, we need to get angry, we need to feel these things, and not just superficially, but like embody them. And I'm a big proponent, or I really recommend doing that in community. You know, sometimes these feelings get so big and scary and it's hard to keep it within one body. And, you know, if you're fortunate enough to be with people who can hold you through experiencing some of these feelings, I think that's really great. And if you don't have somebody, a human body, can earlier, so I'll end with a quote from her. And she says, "If grief can be a doorway to love, then let us weep for the world we are breaking apart so we can love it back to wholeness again."
Thank you both so much for all of your answers tonight and for being honest and present and real. Yeah, that was there are no words for how much I appreciated this experience, and I hope that it was the same way for everybody in the audience tonight. I'm going to send a link in the chat right now for a Google form. There's an answer for an email there. If you would like me to share with you all of the links that were sent in the chat tonight and all of the resources, I will do that after this meeting. But if not, then you guys are welcome to go. I don't want to keep LaUra here any longer. It's so late where she is. But thank you everybody for being here tonight.
Well, and I want to express gratitude to you, Danica, for your questions. I mean, you really helped guide us and guide the conversation tonight. And thank you, Sarah, for your insights and for your work in this realm.
Danica, for bringing LaUra and me together this way. What a treat. Oh, we had so much fun. We want to do it some more, don't we, LaUra? I want to do it more. I should say, I'll speak for myself. I want to do it more. Thank you. And yeah, please, if anybody, I always feel like I love to hear from folks. So if you feel that you feel moved to reach out and just share your experience, I'd love to hear your experience. So I regret that they're just the three of us voices. I'd love to hear some more. I've seen some awesome stuff happen in chats too, but feel free to reach out. I'd love to chat by email. So thanks a lot, Danica, for bringing us together.
Thank you. And sorry, I saw the comment in the chat. If you guys still want me to send it to you and the form's not working, you can just chat me privately your email. Sorry, it's only for UCSB students, but thank you so much, you guys, and good night.
Thank you, folks. Good night. Take care.